All right, well, the title of this is why I can't just sit and watch one of Gary's videos. I've not said anything that could possibly be a lie, right? And I don't think Gary's lying. I think he really, it's more of a self-delusion, lying to the self, but not since I'm calling him a liar just because he's misstated facts. Now, you see, the problem here is that the only thing I've stated that could be a lie is I've stated certain facts of experiments, right? Because if I misstate my interpretation or overstate something, I have to be more careful. That's a mistake, but not a lie. It's also not the kind of mistake that means you're entirely wrong. But even getting your facts wrong sometimes doesn't mean you're entirely wrong. It certainly doesn't mean you can't get your facts straightened up and do better. But if you think I'm lying when I state the outputs of these experiments that I mention, no. And in those cases, there's as little interpretation as you can get in. There's always some, and it can be, you need a frame of reference to avoid a lot of it. But again, that's the interpretive part. The facts of the matter, for example, the mathematical shape of patterns on a detector screen, those are facts. And I would have to be misrepresenting those on purpose to be telling a lie. And it should be obvious that I'm not doing that. Gary is just an ignorant intuitive who is not lying. He's just in a total false reality of his own mental creation, where physics has to seem common sense to things he learned reading science magazines in the 70s. But I did think, well, I could play a little bit of this. I have a meeting in just 40 minutes, so I definitely can't watch the whole hour, but it'll probably just be a few minutes. I haven't watched it yet. And I expect it to be a demonstration of why Gary and I are unable to converse on this subject. But I will try to have a scientific discussion with somebody that I disagree with and who also is about as wrong as you could get.
The second edition of electricity, I did not exactly what I wanted to say, exactly, but it's getting there. But yeah, I got to fix a few things again. But anyway, I just like that it's fits perfectly into the whole thing. You can just see it's.
Why is it so quiet?
But anyway,
here we go.
So this gravitational wave thing. So Numbly Numb went into Piro's room and they went at it for forever. Like a 7-hour room or whatever. Piro was just so obnoxious, and there's just no concession. I mean, it's just Piro just lies about my reaction to gravitational waves, which wasn't some sort of hysterical reaction.
So how is that a lie already? So my understanding of your action, reminding you that it's the few times or I have left a comment. I watched 1 or 2 videos of yours. I watched one of your videos on your reaction to that. You have to call that a lie, because you say what you ought to be saying is that I misunderstood your reaction or blah, blah, blah. Yeah, let's see how hysterical you are about it.
Reaction is wow, they're saying an awful lot with what evidence, what real hard evidence. And it's kind of a bold statement. And the whole thing has so many questions that are unanswered. And so, yeah, that's sort of the point is that this is what science is doing. They're giving you these bad images of gravitational lensing and saying, oh, gravitational lensing, and then gravitational waves and dark matter. And they're just, clearly it just looks like they're just making this stuff up. And
not to me, but see, I worked in doing the data processing in astronomy for years. So when I see the gravitational wave reconstruction of the mass map, so there was a big project a few years ago to took a lot of computing time, 2 galaxies that are colliding. and they look for every gravitational lensing event they could find. Well, it's not hard to find them. You see little weird things that aren't stars. They're little star bits. They're like, camera spikes on a camera. You're looking for these little things that one star screwed up the image of another star behind it. And you could tell because the little spots, they're not round like stars usually. And there'll be more than one as light's bent around the other star that's in front of it. And they have exactly the same spectra, like a fingerprint. So you can use that to see, oh, here's a star, and it's distorting things this amount. And you can reconstruct all the light, how it must be bent, and see where the mass is that must be bending it. And since we don't know of anything else, there's not big crystals in space. So other than that and scatter, that's the only thing that's going to bend light. And the scatter's not going to bend it in a lensing-like way. So then you do the backward processing, which try and understand how it's done, which helps, but whatever, you don't understand how it's done. Fine. So you're going, it just seems awful hard. Okay, I know how it's done. You get back a map of where the mass should be. And it's not where all the stars should be. It's out in the empty of dark space. And if it was regular dust, then the stars behind it, as they shone through, their spectra would have absorption. The dust in that part of space would be absorbing the light from galaxies and stars behind it. Well, galaxies behind it and the stars in those galaxies. But it doesn't. So dark matter's real, and oh dear, we don't know what it is.
None of these people want to sit there and concede that, yeah, this isn't exactly what science should be. It should be...
Oh, well, that's so surprising. Why will none of us concede that science is full of shit? Okay, it's not a lie, Gary. It's just like been discussing race with people, and people assume that I have the same reaction to hearing Ebonics or seeing a baggy pants that they do. I don't have that reaction. I'm not swallowing up that reaction. I'm not looking at science and going, yeah, this is not how science should be done, but I don't want to admit that to Gary. I'm here on the internet saying whatever crazy ass opinion I've got, but not that one. What? No, it's not done shitty. Science is done very carefully. With the way you do science is shitty.
Something to do with like real evidence. Columbo wouldn't go to trial.
See, here they are with devices. They schema up exactly and will tell us all how the devices are working. They work on the devices for years. There's a whole review and engineering culture and review process about the devices. They take data with those devices. They make arguments based on the data that comes out of those devices, and you say they have no evidence. Well, you have literally no evidence. I'm totally happy with the emotional state that you live in, Gary. I, in many cases in the past, have enjoyed talking with you and being exposed to your ideas. I'm interested in your scientific ideas. Now, why, considering they're totally wrong, would I be interested in them? Because I'm interested in how people's thinking ticks, how one idea goes to another. And logic is lovely. I learned formal logic when I was young, and it's how thoughts should go one to the other. There's a lot of things in human life that logic won't really, there is no logic of love. There's no, so plus there's more than one kind of formal logic. And then plus, people have their own logic in the sense of logos is idea or words, and logic is the way of linking one to the other. In other words, illogic is also a kind of logic. Bad logic, faulty logic. That's what people use. Nobody that I know could possibly use just perfect logic in their life because, one, you don't have perfect principles to go from. So that's possibly an issue. But even if you had imperfect principles, a lot of those principles are not processable by logical systems. Like, I love this person. Should I ask them to marry? There's not, logic can say a little bit, but it's not the whole story. So I like finding out ideas, from real people that they really believe, that they honestly believe it. And I don't care how batshit crazy it is. If they honestly believe it, I'm generally curious to know why they believe it. And I've been doing this for decades, so I have a lot in my collection of why people believe the crazy shit and the smart shit that they believe. So some things don't surprise me. The problem is that you have to call me a liar. And obviously one reason you get to that emotional state is because you think that I should be conceding that it's obvious that this isn't how science should work. But all you've complained about science is that you don't understand how they're making the arguments they're making. And you don't want to and don't think you have to follow these arguments because it involves difficult things like formal mathematics, I guess. And you don't have to follow them, but you can't call people trying to follow that shit liars just because you don't get it. Of course, you can do that, but it's ridiculous.
With this stuff, and there should be some sort of apprehension about, or some sort of expectation that you'd have to actually prove these claims, that you just can't make them, that you have to demonstrate them.
See, this is, you're looking insane to me, Gary, because you're saying we're lying. You can't say that we haven't tried to prove our claim, that we don't even recognize, that the scientists don't recognize that they have to prove their claim and demonstrate. You're saying like, why is nobody asking for a demonstration? But they've given a demonstration in many of their data and the mathematical procedures that they're using. You think that is a lie, right? So it becomes like a hoax. So why are you wasting time in your video saying people don't even have to do a demonstration? When they did have to do a demonstration, you're calling the demonstration a lie. Now you're going to pretend it doesn't exist. You're in some psychological loop. You can't pretend. I mean, Nummy was doing this last night too. It's like, well, they haven't demonstrated this thing. They should have measured something. Look, when they measured those gravity waves, they didn't measure gravity waves directly. They measured their device. Their device wiggles and they measure the device. That's what they're always measuring. And then when you say, what's making the device wiggle? John bumped into it, a gravity wave, a neutron, stray neutron hit something. All kinds of things might make it wiggle, right? And he kept saying, well, why don't they demonstrate their science? Why don't they demonstrate? That's what they did for the 8 years when it failed. Well, that must have been useless. No, it allowed them to improve their techniques, to get their quality up to where they didn't have to fail. But you guys just want to say they didn't even do that. They didn't do that. And when I point out they do it, then they're liars, and so they didn't really do it, so we're going to pretend they didn't do it. But illusions exist. If they pretended to do it, that counts as they're doing it, right? But you can say, yeah, but they just pretended. Court of gotcha, you guys are hoaxers, you're lying. But you just say it didn't exist, then you don't have to go in and prove that, because of course that's not what happened. Kip Thorne and the people behind this have been super, super careful. The chances of this being like a cold fusion announcement is nil. But it's the chance that it'll turn out to be something else besides the phenomena they think they looked at or any of that. Who knows what the odds of that are? But the odds that they didn't do the math right and they're lying, blah, 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 nil. They were honest about it. So it's very likely the first in a series. But I'm less sure than I sometimes am. For example, you might remember a few years ago, I predict they came out with some quantum biology results about photosynthesis, which I predicted would be confirmed again, and that we'd have a lot of that. In fact, we have a lot of other quantum biology discoveries coming out, and that's exactly what happened. I'm not saying that here. I don't think they're going to start imaging a lot of very interesting things with this that we see. I don't think people are going to jump and build another version of it anytime soon so we can check. And on the other hand, it is a real result in the sense that they have a certain sensitivity in their device and things like that, because that's all the very easily demonstrable part. And you're stuck pretending that they just built a machine and they won't tell anybody how it works. And now they're telling us that there's gravity waves and we're supposed to take it on faith. And we're not supposed to take it on faith. You obviously don't go very deep into the internets. You need to go to the .edu in Nature and places with the actual papers if you want to make these statements that you make.
And it's just, you know, and this whole argument they had, you know, for the 2 hours was mostly over just a very subtle fact. You know, that they're making this argument that they can do this thing. They can measure this tiny, tiny distance, you know, a human hair over billions of light years or millions of light years. And yeah, it just doesn't make any sense on its face. And then you'd say, well, why don't you just show me some of the wonderful small things you've measured? But they don't do that.
You know, fuck you. This is the end of it. Yeah, Nummy Num was going. I guess he's just repeating you. Look, it's not a measurement device of a funny thing. You have hanging heavy pendulums with mirrors on them, and when they wiggle, you can measure that movement. There's other interferometers are used for measuring tiny things because you can measure things as small as the wavelength of light. Now, that means to get really tiny things, you have to use high frequency light like X-rays, which also destroys tiny little things. So some things you'll shine the light at it and it'll destroy the thing you're trying to look at. But the principle of interferometry, very simple. Nummy Num even understands it. You don't get it. You can measure on the scale of distances on the scale of the wavelength of light. And generally how you do that is there's a light path and mirrors, and the thing being measured is moved to a certain setting, and that changes the light path, and you can use the interferometer to see that change in the light path and measure very, very narrow changes in distance, right? So that technique works for a lot of things. You can also shine a laser around something and see the pattern that it does. There's tricks like that. That gets down to the wavelength of light. This is smaller than a wavelength of light, which is the point of having a really long laser path, really long path. Why is that? Because if you have a path that's changing, right, that the distance is changing and things are at an angle, by having a really long path, you can magnify what would be a tiny change in the light path, right? So if one, well, you know what? I don't even want to say, because let's see, in general cases, obviously the length of the light path itself doesn't put it out of phase. Anyway, I'm forgetting it at the moment. I said last night, I believe, but by having a very long light path, you can magnify that difference, right? You can put the light more out of phase and magnify this little difference so you can see the pattern on the interferometer. It tells you the difference between the two light paths that you're comparing. And with that technique, you can measure things that are quite small. That's just geometry almost. And of course, wave mathematics requires, an interferometer uses the phenomena of interference to compare the two light paths.
There's just nothing. You get nothing.
That's what you've got. See, this is ridiculous. Because here's what I'm interested in about your theory. What it is and what makes you think it. And all you give me on what makes you think it is that everybody else is an idiot and you're working on your system. And your system that's in progress is better than all those idiot systems. In other words, you don't really have reasons for why you think it. You're sketching on your board, your flocks of fish and whatnot, and that's it. You don't have a motivating of why to think it that you want to admit, because the motivation is entirely current science offends your intuition. That's it. That's the whole story. It's 100% of it.